And welcome to Fireside Chats with Longwood University faculty. I am Jennifer Beach, the Research and Instructional Services Librarian here in Greenwood Library. And today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wade Edwards. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Edwards is a professor of turn-of-the-century French culture and also the Assistant Dean of the Cook-Cole College of Arts and Sciences. He has been on faculty at Longwood since 2002 and also serves on the executive board of Pi Delta Phi, a National French Honor Society. Since 2008, Dr. Edwards has partnered with Dr. Sally Scott, a colleague in disability resources, to research, present, and write about the intersections between disability and world language learning, which became the title of the book they published in 2019, which I have right here. So check it out at the library. Dr. Edwards' other publications have appeared in 19th Century French Studies, Feminist Teacher, the NEC TFL Review, and others. And he and Dr. Scott have a recent chapter in a volume of the Applying Universal Design for Learning Across Disciplines, which was published in 2021. All right, so let's get started. So your research centers on the intersections between language learning and disability. Can you tell us about those intersections?
Sure. Back in the day, we used to, there was some scholarly interest in a foreign language disability. So the idea that maybe language learning was actually more difficult for some people than for others, which is absolutely true, but also that there maybe was a specific disability related to second language learning. So they studied that for, about 20 years. And the conclusion was that there isn't a specific disability related to language learning. But the fact that there are so many parts to learning a language can intersect with so many different kinds of disabilities that it's useful to think about a second language disability and how to accommodate students in that situation. And so when we were writing our book and when we had this federal grant, we interviewed students, we did some research, we interviewed students who were both students who were identified with a disability and those without. We talked to them about their language experience. We polled all kinds of students, and we sort of whittled it down to 4 areas in the language classroom that are difficult for students with disabilities, with diagnosed disabilities. So those 4 areas, those intersections were, of course, the target language. And so you know that we teach a lot of our general education, our Civitate level courses in the second language. And so that often was an increased barrier for students with disabilities. Our classes are also very social. We're teaching students to communicate. And so we have a lot of group work activities. We have a lot of extemporaneous conversations, turn to your partner and talk. There'll be some interactions between the faculty and the student too. And so we realized that group work was also another area of concern for students with disabilities. So group work and the target language. We also knew that assessment was difficult for students with disabilities in a special way. Sometimes students with disabilities require more time than normal to complete their assessments, or a private, distraction-free area. But there are other things to think about in assessment of a second language. And then the final component was faculty disposition. Are the faculty ready to teach students with disabilities? Are they aware that their students have disabilities? And so those were the intersections that we focused on especially, and then that's where we continued our research. So the target language, group work, assessment, and faculty disposition.
And for people who haven't taken a foreign language course in a while, that assessment is often listening to verbal reading in that language and then having to either translate it or write down the correct spelling. And so that would be part of the struggles of some students.
Definitely. Our classes involve so many different kinds of activities that there's a likelihood that one of those kinds of activities is going to affect a student with a disability. So if the student has a sort of a phonological disability, listening to new information can be difficult, even in their native language, but certainly in a second language. So listening is a big component of a second language class. Reading and writing, of course, are also, so a student with dyslexia, for instance, might have more trouble than usual reading in a second language or writing in a second language. And then we have students speaking as well. So we have those 4 areas, and each one of those areas can cause a problem for a student. And usually all 4 of those areas are present on an assessment. So there'll be a component where they have to listen and respond. There'll be a section where they need to write answers. There'll be a section where they need to read. And so all of those are different touch points of concern for students with disabilities.
So in your book chapter and also in your book, you talk about universal design and how that would be a method for faculty. So how does well, let's start with a brief overview of what universal design is, and then also how does that inform that inclusive teaching that you're promoting?
Yeah. Well, it's, when people start to focus on students with disabilities, and, we're all interested in helping all of our students succeed. And so often the first question is, if you'll just tell me their disability, I'll be able to help them more.
Right.
And there's some goodwill in that. But first of all, it's against the law to tell you what their disability is. It's up to the student to disclose that if they wish. And so there can be a conversation where the instructor can go to the student and say, tell me about your learning needs, to invite the student to say whatever they wanted to say about how they learn. And so in the post-secondary world, an instructor can't be sure that they would ever know a student's disability or a specific disability. So where universal design comes into play is the idea that if we design classes that serve all students, we won't need to know the disability in order to better serve the student, as long as we're aware of how different disabilities can affect your classroom. So for those who don't know, universal design started as an architectural concept. So it was an idea about how to make the physical space welcoming to all users. And so many people are familiar with those curb cuts that are in a sidewalk so that a wheelchair can get up. You're familiar with like doorknob handles that you don't turn, but actually you either push or you use your elbow or something. So those were, in theory, useful to those with disabilities, but in a universal design concept, they're useful to other people as well. So a curb cut is useful to someone who's got a baby stroller, who's got a shopping cart, who has crutches, who has a short-term disability. It's useful for all, if you're carrying a suitcase, there's all kinds of ways that if you design your environment to be welcoming to lots of people, it will serve lots of people. And so if we think about that in education too, so universal design for instruction, we want to think of the same thing. How can we make our classrooms open to all kinds of students? And so one of those areas that we talk about in the book, there are 9 principles of universal design for instruction. I won't go through all 9 of them, but essentially, you want to make your classroom flexible. If you can make student choice a part of your assignments or your assessments, that's also useful to all students. And so you think of different ways that you can make the class open to all, rather than just to someone with a specific disability.
Okay, so the 4th item that you mentioned at the beginning for identified areas that students struggle was faculty preparedness? Disposition. Yeah. So how can faculty become better allies for students with disabilities?
Yeah. And I'll confess, when I started at Longwood, this was not my world at all. And you're a sympathetic teacher. You're someone who tries to improve with every class and every semester. And so you start to notice there are students who are struggling in my class and I need to learn more. So for faculty disposition, some faculty, especially at Longwood, might only be introduced to a student with disability when they present a letter from the Accessibility Resources Office, and they sort of identify themselves and say, I have a disability and I'm supposed to have additional time to take a test or a private setting for my test. Those are the most common accommodations that faculty have seen. But to go further and to ask more about that student, especially in terms of diversity. So we're aware that we teach diverse students. If we consider disability a form of diversity, then that helps open up new doors for ways of teaching, I guess. And so I think faculty can best serve students with disabilities just by acknowledging that they're in the classroom and acknowledging that maybe we don't know which ones of our students have a disability. Some of them are visible and some of them are not visible. Some of them are registered to the disability office and some of them aren't. And so just being open to the idea that your class needs to be more welcoming to students with disabilities is helpful. So some concrete ways. So, many faculty put that disability statement on their syllabus now to say, please come see me if you have concerns related to a disability. For a student with disability, that's magic, because it says, here's someone willing to listen. And so if I, as the student, am aware of my learning needs, here's a faculty member willing to listen to what I need. So that's sort of basic bottom line way to be inclusive to students with disabilities. Another way that we use in the foreign language classes is to start with a foreign language learning autobiography. And so very early on in the semester, we'll ask students about how they learn. What were your favorite classes? What classes are you good at? What kind of instruction do you like? What kind of instruction do you not like? And we always ask them to complete this sentence. For me, foreign language learning is like, and then we sort of leave it open-ended and they tell us what they want to tell us. And often it comes down into sort of two camps: the students who have high anxiety about learning a second language, and those who are excited by learning a second language and talk about the sort of magic and open doors that it can create. And so it's really fun to get those answers, because some students are really frank, and you can hear a lot about their anxieties and their experiences in the past. And then you hear the excitement from the other students too. We collect those and then we share them with the students in our class early in the semester. And that helps create sort of a metacognitive understanding of how to learn a language, and also that you're not alone. If you're scared of this class, there are 5 other students equally as scared. And if you're excited by this class, there are 5 students equally as excited by this class. And so having that conversation early on lets students know that you're open to learning from them. And so I think that's one way. A second way that faculty can be better allies to students with disabilities: just ask them how they learn.
As you know, I have audited classes in French in the last few years, and I filled out that form several times, and I will say I never realized that it was more than just a getting to know you thing. What a wonderful tool to let students tell you what they're feeling without targeting specific students.
Right. And it lets the student acknowledge what they need to acknowledge. Sometimes it spurs the student, because it really is, in the college level, it really is the student's responsibility to tell us what they need. And some students aren't ready to do that yet. And so this is a form that maybe, helps them out a little bit. It's really useful, and we learn all kinds of great things. And so some people say, and there's been some scholarly research on this as well, not by us, but by others, where learning a second language often has sort of bodily sort of pain involved. And so students write about pulling out their teeth one by one very slowly, or about driving a nail into their head at 8 in the morning. Like, these are their real fears about learning a second language. And others talk about windows onto a new world, and sort of the opportunities and sort of the superpower you get when you can speak a second language. You get really good answers. And I think my favorite answer to that question is, for me, learning a second language is like a window onto a new world that I want to jump out of. And so it's both, right? It's like exciting and painful all at the same time. People talk about wearing a new pair of shoes or dancing backwards, or, all kinds of things like that. So it's nice to have those conversations. How do you learn a second language, and what are your possible barriers, and how can we alleviate them?
So it sounds like one of the ways that faculty can be better allies is to be mindful of those differences between their students, and not necessarily assume that just some like it and some don't.
Yes, I think that's great. And also, I think the first hurdle for faculty to get over is to think that they've been hired to teach, say, French. There's a great piece that I came across early in our research by Marshall Gregory. And so he's talking about when he goes to a cocktail party and people ask him, what do you do? And he says, I teach French. And they say, oh, I took French and I don't remember any of it anymore. Or, there's sort of a common cocktail party scenario. He says, what if we change the answer? Instead of saying, I teach French, and your answer is instead, I teach students French. And so your success as a teacher is not how well you know your discipline, it's how well you know your students. And so that works great for students with disabilities and other kinds of students as well. But if you approach it, how do I teach this student in front of me French, more than just, I know French and here's how I'm going to teach it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what support is available for instructors who wish to develop more inclusive teaching practices?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. When we were running our grant, we had a couple of a year-long kind of workshop series where we worked with everyone who was teaching a second language at Longwood for several months. And so we started at the beginning of the semester with a 3-hour workshop when we sort of talked about disability generally, we talked about language learning generally, and then we started to drill a little bit deeper. And then we had sort of hour-long workshops on each of those 4 items I told you about. So group work and target language learning and assessment and faculty disposition. I'm sure Cafe is a great resource for this kind of thing. I don't know that they zero in specifically on disabilities, but many sort of teaching workshops will include ways that you can adapt at least to students with disabilities. I'll say the thing the way I keep up on this is through Twitter. And so I'm a pretty active Twitter person. And so I follow accounts by people who have disabilities, and especially those who are in education, either as students or as educators with a disability. And you learn all kinds of really fun things. There's a great cartoonist who draws about having a disability, and her cartoons about ADHD are just magnificent. So I guess just be curious, right? That's one of the ways that faculty can improve too, is just to be curious.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us for Fireside Chats with Longwood faculty. Be sure to check out our channel for our other wonderful interviews. And Wade, this was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. All right. See you later.
Bye-bye.